Hello, I'm here with Amy Edmondson, a professor of leadership and management at Harvard Business School. She barely needs introduction to the healthcare education community and the healthcare simulation education community, but I want to say that I think Amy's effectively changed so many of our thinking about how to create environments where people can learn, not only in formal settings like simulation, but informal settings of everyday work. And so I'm really thrilled to be here with you, Amy. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And that's about as gracious an introduction as I could ever have. Thank you.
Well, it's very easy. As a doctoral student in organizational behavior myself, I remember reading one of your first articles, which was this study of psychological safety on nursing units. And I remember going through the article and finding it kind of surprising and amazing in certain ways. And then later I've read a little biography or biographical statements by you where you also found it really surprising. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your journey of accidentally stumbling on psychological safety.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it was an accident, right? So I always think, the idea for which I am best known was just completely accidental. And you could even say it was a failure story because I was very fortunate to be asked to join what was later clearly a landmark study of medication error led by Lucian Leap and David Bates. And the reason I was asked to join was they, in their wisdom, I think, decided we should measure team attributes. The main purpose of the study was to be as absolutely accurate as possible in assessing the actual error rate. And these were the early days of interest in medical error at a growing scale. And my part was simply to come in, and this is so relevant to the simulation community, because my part was to come in and see whether I could assess the team properties of the different medical units in the study. And the reason why Doctors Leap and Bates wanted that to be done was that they had been influenced by the aviation research. And that, as you know, occurred in a simulator setting where different teams, different aviation teams, cockpit crews, if you will, were in simulators. And it turned out, it's not the smartest ones or anything else. It's the best teams that made the fewest errors in the simulator. So they thought, what the heck, right? While we're at it, doing all this work to collect error data, why don't we have someone come in and just measure the team properties? And then we'll be able to show that, like in aviation, better teams make fewer mistakes. Great. Sounded good to me, right? And I was...
Excellent hypothesis.
Yeah, sign me up. That's the hypothesis. So I distributed the survey in month 1 of a 6-month study. Over a 6-month period, trained medical investigators ascertained error rates in several different ways, through going to the units and asking people what they saw, what they were aware of, through a box, a confidential reporting system where you could insert things, and through chart review. And, they were pretty excited about that work, and I was excited to get those data when they were finally available. And then I ran my correlations, and here's the surprising part. Well, actually, surprise 1 was indeed there was a significant correlation between something as soft, if you will, as team work, team properties, and error rates. So that felt good for a second and a half. And then I suddenly realized with fear that the sign was in the wrong direction. In other words, the data were suggesting that the better teams, according to a well-validated survey instrument, had higher, not lower, error rates. That was deeply puzzling and also a little bit problematic because that aviation work was partly my 6'4" thesis advisor's work, and I was a little scared to go, tell him of this strange result. So that forced me to sit down and think about it. And I suddenly, in thinking, had the thought, maybe the better teams aren't making more mistakes. Maybe the better teams are more able and willing to talk about mistakes. And from my work on the study, I knew enough about the care delivery process, how interdependent it is, how complex it is, how essentially it's a complex error-prone system. So I started to think, maybe the good people understand that, and because of what's at stake, i.e. human life, they're willing to be open about it because they want to fix and catch and correct. Okay. Turns out to be a relatively long story to go from having that insight to being able to prove it, if you will. But I was able to traverse that journey. When all was said and done, I think I had both Lucian Leap and David Bates as big converts to that way of thinking. And then we all began to think more clearly about, as Edwards Deming said, how do you drive fear out of the organization so that learning can come in? Now, I will say about that paper, because you can read that paper if you want, it never uses the term psychological safety because I wasn't aware of that term yet. So I called it interpersonal climate. A little while I called it reporting climate, and it wasn't until my next study that I started calling that climate psychological safety.
Right. And so the kind of shocking accidental discovery in your research done while you were a doctoral student, right, was that the units where nurses felt more unsafe reported lower levels
of errors.
Yep. And it was really a reporting function. It's a symptom, it's a sign of the willingness of people on high to listen and the perceived riskiness of the environment. And when it's less risky, people report more.
Right. And the bad news for that study was what I was kind of suggesting is we may not be getting the definitive error rate after all. In fact, we may be getting a biased error rate and an error rate that is biased systematically by something as squishy as interpersonal climate.
Which are some of the cool findings many years later that you've had a look at in various other contexts, like the perioperative environment, and even Google took a look at what made their best teams good, and that same kind of psychological safety allowed them to detect and correct error more quickly and innovate.
Exactly. So the variable has had a nice long history since that early study.
Then fast forward a couple years or a few years, you did your doctoral dissertation looking explicitly now at the role of psychological safety on this thing called learning behaviors. That, I think, is what has resonated so strongly with all of us in the healthcare education community, which is how do we set a safe container for people to speak up when they don't know the answer, express that they don't know, et cetera, et cetera. It's been sort of a silo-busting, hierarchy-flattening, in some ways, anthill stepping on moment where all of our usual ways of organizing work in healthcare, long-term process improvement, checking everything carefully up 3 levels, not necessarily communicating effectively across silos, has suddenly and surprisingly become very possible. And what I'd love to hear from you, if you're willing, is in those kinds of contexts, which, by the way, you described so beautifully in your TED Talk.
The Chilean mine rescue, yeah.
Talk to me, if you would, a little bit about the attributes of either teaming or creating a fearless organization that you've described so beautifully in your books. How do you see those playing out in these kinds of environments?
A wonderful question. And, as I have been observing, albeit from a distance, the work that's happening in hospitals, it's of course been crisis situations. It's almost battlefield medicine. Crises, by their very nature, break down some of the barriers, some of the hurdles, some of the resistance to change. And people tend to show up and try to do their very best because the need for it is just too acute to ignore, right? You're not in a position where you can say, well, maybe we'll think about that tomorrow or next week. We have to think about it now. That is not the same as saying crisis always brings out the best in people. I think crisis often creates an opportunity to bring out the best, but we can all think of crises where not the best happened and where a lack of leadership, let's say Katrina, or even COVID itself on the national level. Crises don't always lead to good behavior, but the good behavior that you can have in a crisis is quite distinctive and worth learning from. And so specifically, and I'll drop the case study, as you said, that I've done the deepest work on to understand this and to understand is the Chilean mine rescue. And just in a nutshell, we had 33 men trapped below 700 meters of some of the hardest rock in the world, with no known drilling technology in the industry capable of getting through that rock at that depth fast enough to save their lives. They had just a little bit of food and so on. And yet, fast forward 70 days, all 33 men are brought out alive. It's nearly impossible. And the answer to how that was possible is a remarkable combination of ingenuity and innovation and teamwork across sector lines, across silos of all kinds. But the bottom line really is leadership. And I don't mean one person. I mean the function of leadership that shows up in a particular way to help bring out all that ingenuity and teamwork and problem-solving behavior. And if I had to encapsulate what those leaders did at several different levels, it starts with what I'll call situational humility, which is being very overt about how little we know, how clear it is that we've never been here before. I'm willing to say that. I'm willing to keep calling attention to it, because that is a stance from which others are willing to offer their ideas. And nobody can be embarrassed that they don't already have answers or that they don't already have expertise in this area. So situational humility was a big deal in the Chilean rescue. I think it's a big deal, as I understand it, in some of the ways that people in hospitals during this tough time have made progress. There's also framing the opportunity as a problem-solving learning opportunity, doing that deliberately, doing it again and again, seeking, inviting input, offering help. And finally, even though it seems obvious, I don't think it can be said often enough, it's keep revisiting, keep emphasizing purpose, why it matters, even when you think it's obvious, such as when you have very, very sick people in your ICU, and of course you're trying to save their lives. That seems like the purpose part should hardly need to be said. Turns out that's not right. Turns out we need leaders to keep reminding us, because we're tired, we're cranky, we haven't gotten enough sleep, and we need help getting back to that stance of the better angels of our nature.
Those are so helpful. So the situational humility by the leader, which implicitly and through things that you've written about in the past, leader inclusiveness behaviors, inviting input, asking people to speak up, seems really important. Framing it as a learning opportunity and emphasizing purpose. I wanted to just dig in a little bit on the framing it as a learning opportunity, because I think as a leader of a small organization, and I think many of the leaders that I'm talking to right now, struggle with the tension, even in the middle of a crisis, of appearing to layer on anything and using the language of learning, I think to many people strikes them as like, oh, I do education on the side. What do you mean learning? Like, we've got a serious problem here. So could you talk a little bit about what you mean in that context?
Absolutely. And you're right. I often forget that. The word learning sounds like school. And that's actually not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, I can describe it this way, learning behaviors. And learning behaviors are asking a question, sharing information, noticing a problem and speaking up about a problem. So probably a better term than learning is problem solving. And in a situation, especially any situation that's novel, that's not routine. In other words, we're not just taking a playbook off the shelf and following it. We're kind of having to figure it out, at least some aspects of it, while we go. That means that what we're actually doing is problem solving. And so I'll contrast that, problem solving or learning, if you don't mind the term.
No, I don't. Of course not.
With mere execution, right? So mere execution, I would argue, is the cognitive default. It's the default mental model. You know, when you're at work, you think you're supposed to do your work, which you are.
Right.
But that's the wrong frame, because you're not supposed to just do your work in the sense of practice your expertise and get things done. You have to do your work as a scientist. You have to do your work as if you are gathering data in the process of doing your work, because you are. That's a learning frame rather than an execution frame. for making progress. You're still getting your work done, but you're getting it done with this tremendous sense of humility and openness and deep attention to detail and feedback.
Right, and we can do it better. So I think what's really interesting here is you're talking in a sense about metacognition in the everyday. You're talking about what our intellectual grandfather, Chris Argyris, would call action science, what my mentor, Bill Torbert, would call action inquiry, double loop learning, which is, are we looking at our assumptions? Are we looking at our processes as well as doing them? And that's kind of my personal raison d'etre. I love that. That's what I do every day. That's what makes me get out of bed in the morning. And I want us to keep trying to clarify for the very busy leader who has the very busy colleagues who feel totally pressed to the wall. What's your language for us around why we can do this? How can we innovate? How can we do these micro innovations when we feel like we have no time?
Here's two ways of answering it. And the first is that the very research that led Chris Argyris and his intellectual thought partner, Don Schern, understand the need for attentiveness to feedback in doing your work came from the study of good clinicians. And when I say good clinicians, I don't mean just physicians, although they were in the sample, but also architects and other professionals who, by the very nature of the work, the good ones, the great ones, are enormously attentive to what the work is saying back to them, right? A good doctor practices her craft, right? A great doctor practices her craft and is seeing things that surprised or things that reassured, and is a scientist, right? Is enormously attentive to how the craft is speaking back or how the patient conditions are speaking back. So one aspect is, in fact, I don't think you can really separate learning and doing in the practice of healthcare, right? So for those very busy clinicians, realize in part you're doing this already, right? It's like the bourgeois gentilhomme who was pleased to discover he already knew how to speak prose. You're doing this already. But the second answer is, if it wasn't necessary to do sort of learning as you go, then we wouldn't spend so much time trying to advocate it. The problem is you don't actually have the luxury of just doing it in your sleep, right? And you already know that. It's not necessarily taking more time. In fact, sometimes the things that take the most time are the work we have to redo because we weren't doing it in a learning enough mode. We were doing it in our sleep and something went wrong and then we have to redo it. So an awful lot of time and resources are wasted in organizations, including healthcare organizations, because we're not doing execution as learning.
So I think this focus on the fact that learning in the moment may appear temporarily to take more bandwidth or take more time. But if we look out a little bit longer, it's going to prevent rework, or it's going to make us innovate, or it's going to have us be more efficient. There'll be downstream benefits in addition to all the psychological and emotional benefits that I think I and so many others treasure from your work about making it more connected and more alive. To be together, that part of learning is beautiful, but you've also written about, and now you're talking about the kind of effectiveness benefit.
Yeah, in some ways you could say that if you're not a learning organization, and I don't mean an education organization, but if you're not an organization that has found ways to hardwire little feedback loops into everything it does, you will get caught unawares in a fast-changing, complex world.
Absolutely. So speaking of which, I'd like to shift gears and think with you a little bit about some of the marvelous ideas from your 4 books on teaming and the Fearless Organization. We've never defined psychological safety while we've been talking. So do you mind if how are you thinking about it? What is it?
Yeah. So let's do that. So, I will define psychological safety as low interpersonal risk, where interpersonal risk is a force that keeps you from speaking up with any kind of content whether it's a question or an idea or a mistake that you believe others might hold against you. All right, that was a long-winded definition, but fundamentally, there's this worry that we all have about what others think of us, and we don't want to mess it up. And so the easy thing to do is to hold back, right? Not to take the risk. And so psychological safety is a kind of weird state, because if you have psychological safety, you're willing to take those risks. Like you're willing to step in there and maybe get it wrong because you know that your colleagues are sort of there for you. You know, they're not going to just kick you out of the tribe just because you got something wrong.
In healthcare, so many organizations have lost so much money. So there's this huge downward pressure on salaries and people, and there's layoffs. It feels very fraught right now. And so I think your ideas have potentially some guidance or help for us.
So on the one hand, psychological safety, or a sense that I can take interpersonal risks, has never been more important, because there are a load of interpersonal risks out there needing to be taken. I need to be willing to say something that might just absolutely put my foot in it because I got it wrong and I didn't understand it and I was clueless. Right? I got to be willing to do that or else I won't learn. On the other hand, you said, and I agree, it's fraught, which by definition makes psychological safety low. Right? When things are fraught, that means they're interpersonally risky. And when things are interpersonally risky, that means psychological safety is not present. So how do we turn that around? I mean, how do we make it safe to get it wrong on the way to getting it right?
I think that is a crucial challenge. And a lot of your work looks at what are kind of high learning, you use the word high learning frames, low learning frames. But I think some of us can be a little overwhelmed by the size of the challenge. And I think your work suggests some chunks, maybe internally how we look at what we do, potentially how we talk to each other. Thoughts on that?
Well, you know, I study people in workplaces to try to get some sense of what works and what doesn't. But you actually do it, right? You actually run simulations. And I know that when you do that, you explicitly put things in place to try to make it psychologically safe so that the simulation environment can be a learning environment. So you're more in the practice of it. And what do you do?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about this, of how can we create a safe container for learning. We do this thing called briefing or pre-briefing before we do a simulation, and we make some agreements with the group. Hey, listen, I'm asking all of you to hold the basic assumption about me. I'm intelligent, I'm capable, I'm trying to do my best, I want to improve. I'm assuming those same things of you, but you know what? I'm likely to make some mistakes. Please help me learn from that. And we can also try to create some agreements across role groups about how we might do that. That's some of that. Yeah.
I love that. But I love that because you're in my terms, you're framing the context, right? And you're also framing your own role as someone who is well-meaning and capable and smart and who will make mistakes. I mean, you are a fallible human being. Turns out all of us are. And so I think that's a really nice frame to put in place. And to me, that's actually the first thing I write about in the chapter of Fearless Organization that's dedicated toward, okay, what can you do? What are the tools? What are the little practices that can really change the game? That's a big one. And it's kind of abstract to say, oh, frame the work, but you just illustrated it so nicely.
So it's kind of embedded with the work. So, Amy Edmondson, we're going to wrap up in the next minute or two. And in that time, I'd love to just kind of give you the final word on this sort of flattened hierarchy, silos busted, all that stuff. That's all going away really quickly as the budgets constrain and the bureaucracy leaks back in and so on. And I wonder if you could share any thoughts about how do we pull the wonderful good crisis leadership, the good teaming, the fearless organization stuff into our everyday life.
It really is a leadership challenge. And like any leadership challenge, I think the first step is to name it. Let's make it not an implicit big task that lies ahead, but an explicit one. So I think everybody understands, or can easily be helped to understand, just how real that challenge is. To shift from almost like startup mode, right? What you've just been through has been, you're in a startup and you're willing to do the crazy hours and the endless work and the breaking down of the silos because so much is at stake, you care, and there doesn't really seem to be any choice. And now as we shift toward, the temporary new normal, it's not necessarily a setup that's going to bring out the very best in all of us, particularly under resource constraints. Don't try to solve it yourself. Right? Make it an opportunity for open source innovation. Ask people, what ideas can you have? Because this sort of almost looks impossible, but in my heart of hearts, I know we can do it.
So that re-emphasizing the situational humility, the framing it as a problem that we can all grapple with, and emphasizing the purpose.
Yes.
Sounds really great. Well, Amy, thank you so much for taking this time to be with me. It's been a total joy.
Thank you for the work you do, Jenny.
What if building leadership and connection skills in real life was less about grand epiphanies and more about small, consistent reps? The way athletes train, the way musicians practice, the way simulation refines teaming and clinical performance. Push-ups, sit-ups, building up your cardio. We put challenges and weights in front of ourselves to get fit. We embrace no pain, no gain. Yet when we find something difficult in real life, especially an interpersonal something, we often skitter away. We put down the weight and walk away from the workout. Curious Now helps us lean into those everyday interactions, the awkward silences, simmering tensions, and high-stakes conversations, and treat them like reps in a leadership gym. Curious Now, stronger later.